I'm so happy that I can bring you into contact and connection with our Spanish speaking community. Since we met last year before last, whenever that was, a year before last, I think. Um, I learned so much from you in the time that we shared about indigeneity and the way that you show up in Buddhist spaces to offer that into that field. And I just want to ask you to, first of all, situate us in the world that you're moving in.
Well, first and foremost, in the best that I have, hola, ¿cómo está? Me llamo Beatriz. I am so grateful to be able to co-create an opportunity to share more about my road in the Dharma and how that um, is equivalent to me to my practice and my Indigenous-based practices, and my relationship as an Indigenous person. Um, And first and foremost, because this is my way, this is how I've been taught, and this is what I believe is an aspect of Indigenous life, is that I want to first start by honoring just the ground that we're on. So I'm taking a moment just to feel my feet against the earth, to feel the weight of my body that's allowed to sit on a chair because of gravity. That's significant to this planet. And taking a moment to be aware of the production of water or saliva in my mouth that mimics the waters around me. I'm taking a moment to be present to the breath that's breathing through my body, made possible by the trees and the plants. I'm taking a moment to be present to the experience of light hitting the eyelids and the face, and giving awareness to a new day, a new month, new season, to life. And then I'll pause now to give thanks to my family, those who birthed me, those that are chosen, my spiritual teachers, friends, and elders, and my ancestors who made and who continue to make my life possible. May our time together in this exchange be one of integrity and clarity and a commitment to the good things of all of the many relatives that I spoke of before. Mm. Yeah, cookie. Ashe, ashe. So it is. Mm. Okay. So I'm here on Chumash territory, mm, mm, Southern California. Mm. And I came into the practice of mindfulness in many ways. And the first and foremost was through my family. Mm. My mother is from Mississippi and is Black and Native. The Black side from West Africa as a Fulani woman, nomadic people who knew the deserts and how to source water. And my native side, Choctaw and Blackfoot, Choctaw Mississippi band. And I've been doing for the last almost 10 years a rematriation into my Choctaw lineage and language as asked of me by my elder ancestors. And on my father's side, I am Jamaican Maroon, the African aspect, indigenous African peoples are Balanta, is my father's tribe, by way of West Africa. They were warriors and bush people. They loved nature, loved herbal medicine, and plants. And Maroon is the indigenous peoples of Jamaica by way of Africa that formed their own free towns through, yes, treaty, but also their spiritual prowess and their solidarity with the Taino people of Jamaica or Yamaka. They won their freedom and independence from the British and have been free, sovereign communities ever since. And you can find our people originally in Suriname, Guyana, and brought to Jamaica and Trinidad. So that means I got a whole bunch of indigenous in me. It's just like you. But I have a lot in me that has been told through story or action or ideology in my family. My awareness of contemplative practice, meditation, awareness, mindfulness, comes from this understanding of what it means to be indigenous. The prayer and the opening grounding practice that I did is primarily rooted in that understanding that we are of the earth. We honor all of our many relatives, as we say in Turtle Island. And to be aware of the water, the air, the plants, the trees, and all of our kinfolk is a deep practice of mindfulness. So we don't walk this earth in a supremacy of our human nature. We honor the great creator that has made all things, and we are but a fraction of that. Interbeing. The acknowledgement that my being is intertwined with all of life. A dear teacher of mine, Thích Nhất, a Vietnamese teacher in Buddhism, master teacher, who was, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King, a Black man who knew that his vision of peace and the interbeing of all life toward that could work together towards finding freedom for everybody. Felt true to his cause of civil disobedience. So Thai, Thich Nhat Hanh, taught a lot about interbeing, as he not only saw it through his tradition as a Buddhist, but also his life as a Vietnamese man, looking at the rice fields, watching his elders, this relationship to all of life and paying attention to it, not taking it for granted. One might say is the essence of what it means for many indigenous communities. I studied this concept of indigenous for myself, but actually as a path of my practice in the Dharma, in mindfulness and meditation in Buddhism. I had no knowledge then that it would be the very thing that I would teach now, but it is. I really did it for myself. I had a teacher, I have a teacher, her name is Tia Strozer, and she is a Jewish um, elder, senior Zen priest, their San Francisco Zen Center. And she taught me very early on about the aspects of Zen that were deeply rooted to the earth. When we walk into a meditation hall and there's burning incense, that the essence of that is incense is an acknowledgement of the earth. That similar to native traditions, when we burn certain plants, the smoke from it, or we light a fire, the smoke from it connects those that are here to our ancestors or to the heavens, lifting our prayers and our intentions for our world. It's very similar, just in the burning of incense. So it was teachings like this early on in my practice that made me think, there's more to learn here. I want to know because this sounds familiar and how I grew up. So, in addition to my family, the family that became my spiritual family also helped me to understand the my definition of indigeneity, as especially as it relates to contemplative practice or Buddhism. And I would say beyond that, just how to be an upright human being in this world. This isn't about my tradition or spiritual or religious practice. This is about my spirit, how I choose to live this life. It's funny, Thich Nhat Hanh, I went to one of his retreats very early on, and it was about 1,000 people. And the retreat center had been almost hand built by the community, local Hmong and Vietnamese community or Vietnamese community, and the inhabitants, those who were directly around the area. The people who lived around that area predominantly lived in trailer homes. The people who came to that retreat center showed up in Bentleys. Those who held that retreat had nothing but probably 5 pairs of robes. a large portion of those who attended that retreat were Christian. This very diverse space that was learning not just the teachings of Buddha, but how to be a good person. No matter your faith, how to be in right relationship to all beings, interbeing, how to live connected to the earth, indigenous, or the teachings of Thai. So my spiritual community really helped me to understand what it meant to be indigenous. In other aspects of my life, I went on to develop a school called Song of the Spirit that I sunset now and focus on one particular project of that school now. But it was a school to help people rematriate to their indigenous traditions globally. And so learning the language directly from a community partner and or elder teacher of mine in that land and or space. So for example, in Anahuac, Temi is the dear elder who was teaching Totekayo to family and community of Anahuac who wanted to rematriate into the indigenous language and lands of what is known as Mexico. We also had Yao in Ghana teaching Tree, Foluke in Nigeria teaching Yoruba, and so on, Zimbabwe, etc. But my desire was to, in that, similar to what I had learned in all of these different places, like my desire in this school was to help recenter the wisdom in indigenous peoples, cultures, and traditions. And to let us speak it ourselves, not let it be taken away and someone else teach it, but to allow for those who are often unseen to really be heard and known for our sciences, our practices, our relationship to the earth, our spiritual tradition, and our wisdom that can help support our world to being better. Through that school, I've met so many beautiful people, as you imagine, lots of elders from many indigenous communities and tribes, clans. And at some point in the beginning, I asked them, what does it mean to you to be indigenous? I'd repeat this over and over again, or when we sat in a virtual gathering like this, I'd ask, and it would be the same things. And this I eventually went on to develop as a framework with their permission that I now teach. They said very simple things. A relationship to spirit. And spirit being the being that animates life, that makes the leaves move, that makes breath possible in our body, that makes the ocean waves undulate. Spirit, in the many ways that we call that. Two, our relationship to this planet and to the cosmos, but mostly this planet, to the soil, to the water, to our animals, how we are in relationship to it, how we hold it, how we take care of it, how we honor it, how we sing to it, how we make offerings to it. That how we take it, don't take it for granted when we sit and we eat a plate of food and we look at it, when we pray over it. Yeah. How we honor the farmers that brought us our food, how we center those who really work the land. Okay, so that's two. Three, our purpose. Purpose. Malidoma Somé, who was a very incredible teacher, I highly recommend his book of Water and Spirit, which is an autobiographical book, though it reads like fantasy. He's from the Dagara people in West Africa. Sorry, East Africa. He speaks of this relationship to purpose as being what is the fourth point, a contribution to community. And purpose in some native traditions here on Turtle Island are like like when you go on, there's a thing called a vision quest. You go through a rite of passage at a particular age, and some still now practicing traditional communities, native communities, where a young person goes through a series of different rituals that help them to figure out what their purpose is in this life and what they're meant to do for their community, their tribe, this world, to understand what their quest was to coming in this lifetime. This is very similar in so many indigenous communities that you came here for a reason and put it to good use. So purpose. In one of my traditions in Yoruba, in Ifa, we would say it's related to something called Ori, O-R-I. And this is like one's highest self, the knowing self that has and holds the purpose or destiny of a being. And then the fourth, community, family, our global world, your relationships. But in indigenous community, right, this is everything. It's everything. This is the continuum of how we stay alive. It's through our community. It's through the preservation of our songs that we sing with each other, the language that we speak with one another, the food that we make together, the stories that our elders teach us. It's the hair, it's the clothing that we wear and make. It is community. Some part of that just made me a little sad. I think it's because I've also, throughout my time creating Song of the Spirit, a big reason why I made the school is because I was clear that many, especially during COVID, many indigenous communities that I attribute to ensuring that our planet keeps spinning. That's how amazing indigenous communities are to me. But there are many indigenous communities who are now on the brink of going extinct, completely dying off because of the loss of language, because of, in some cases, the necessity of having to sustain themselves. So young people leave and go into the cities and westernize and don't come back because of the degradation of their community that isn't the humankind, but the forests, the jungles. And I know I'm speaking to the choir, you already know. So there's a part of me that, yeah, still is holding a lot of sadness there for that. So when I speak of indigenous, this is what I mean. Those that hold a significant day-to-day relationship to those four things. Their waking moment is an awareness of those four things. They rise with the sun to do specific prayers to honor the earth, where before their feet touch the ground, they hold their head and honor their purpose in this life.
Mm.
Or when they greet another person, they see themselves inside of the reflection of that person and don't take their life for granted. This way of being, my elders and teachers and community have helped me to learn means what it means to be indigenous. Not native. I want to make that a very clear distinction. And I say that as someone who is native. I can be native to a place. I can be native to a place. Indigenous for me is the essence of a being. It is the practice. It is my culture. It is my tradition. It is my song. It is my dance. It is my relationship to that place. So native, especially also, I will say, is they're both very political. The native for Turtle Island folks is very political. Our land back movement is based on those who are native to this land. This is home of this place. And I've been in some really important conversations, ones that have been very humbling, and ones that have been very affirming, and ones that have been very challenging around honoring what it means for me to be Black Native, for me to be Indigenous, global Indigenous or Indigenous, and having those things questioned because of the color of my skin. The continent of Africa is where we found the first bones of all beings. One might say yeah, the cradle of civilization. And yet, because of Westernization and colonization, most specifically, the fear of Blackness and the stories told about my and your people have stripped it of the dignity of what it means to be indigenous to the planet. So I honor the traditions of what it means to be Native very much. And I don't actually say native to any other place but Turtle Island. Just have to say, when I use that language, I'm speaking of native peoples of Turtle Island. I just want to be very clear. Every other place that I go and I meet Indigenous people, and I also call them Indigenous as well. I call us Indigenous because that's our unifier. And I would love for us as Native peoples to keep seeing that. It is a disservice when we don't. And we are only recreating the same systems of genocide and oppression that have happened to us. And yes, everywhere else I go, I say indigenous. I get to see my kin, and we know each other, and we speak the similar language, and We understand even when the tongue is different, the practice is the same. That is powerful. It's a powerful gift, a powerful medicine, and also one that our world needs now more than ever, I believe. Indigenous can connect all people, and it does, and I've seen it. So that is how we're grounding this conversation. That is how I enter into a dialogue about the Dharma and or mindfulness, meditation, Buddhism, through this understanding of it as an indigenous practice, an indigenous tradition, one that came very much from the earth, and maybe one that's lost its way a little bit from
Yeah. And I would like to invite you to explore for people whose spiritual calling or nourishment is coming from the Buddhist path and who might be interested either in them re-indigenizing themselves
that.
or understanding what from either their indigenous ancestry or
Mm,
neighbors might nourish their Buddhist practice.
mm,
What would you say? What do you see for
mhm.
them?
Well, let's go way back. So the origin of this beautiful Buddhist path, right? Let's really talk about the origin. And you've got Damcho here who knows even more than I. But from what I gravitate towards, or the kernels that I really hold on to, was that this path and tradition was surrounded, and I say path and tradition, right, because it came out of this being that was surrounded left and right and center of traditions that were incredibly earth-based. Hinduism, right? Like we're talking about traditions that ate indigeneity as breakfast in the description that I gave. So it would be very hard for what we know as Shakyamuni Buddha to not be impacted, even intuitively, by some of those four things that I mentioned: community, sangha. I could go on and on and on and just describe those things. It would be very hard. It was the culture of India and Nepal. The culture, the people, the sound, the smell, the taste. That is what it was. So I like to remind people that this tradition isn't just what happens on the cushion and or was just created by what we see in our Western Dharma centers. It was the culture of a people that influenced the path and the life of a being that then continue to do that over and over and over again for forever. You know? So one, I just want to honor the people of Lambari, Nepal, our family and our community of South Asia who have held the roots of this tradition, the lands, the Himalayas, the trees, the mountains, the rivers, that is this tradition. Okay. I want to start there, which if you go back to my four things, that's real indigenous. So first and foremost, I'd like to suggest first noticing, wow, okay, what in my culture uh, may be similar as we keep going through what I'll share in how I grew up, or how the lands look, or how we honor our lands. or the songs that we sing. I want you to just notice those similarities for yourself. Okay. So then this beautiful being that went out on their vision quest to find themselves, to know who they are and their purpose in this life, set out without all these things so their feet could touch the earth and they could be humbled by this planet. They could see the wheat and they could see the cows and they could see more than themselves. But their relationship to their being, and I'm talking about Shakyamuni Buddha, their being and all the beings around them sounds still really indigenous to me. And where they sat, they didn't sit on a bus stop. They sat under a tree and put their back against the tree. Oh my gosh, with this beautiful shade, I'm imagining it offered from a very hot, sticky place. And watch spirit as it moved through the leaves and the plants and felt its connection there. And that same breath and air and animation that filled their body. They were now one of it. And yes, I know I'm using they and them. I'm doing that intentionally, but and they sat. Some believe they rocked. With this wisdom that came and entered in, this consciousness, this awareness of who they were in relationship to the whole planet and what was possible, what all of us were capable of, came out of this seeking an understanding of life, this purpose. The knowing that there was something more sacred and significant than being a king, or what he was destined to become, a very powerful warlord. So what I'll offer is, first and foremost, there's not much when I think of global indigenous peoples, and similar to Buddha, who lived in community and or a world or society where, though there maybe it might have been much more prevalent, right, there was still opulence and forms of capitalism. There was still the things. But there was also this presence of indigeneity that was buzzing around them constantly in life. These rituals and practices, and it was present. And I would say the same for many of the places where we exist. If we look for it, we will find it. And so seeing and or being with that expression of indigeneity that exists in small and also very profound ways throughout your life, whether it is your claim of being indigenous or not, you will see that it is pervasive in your everyday life. Many of you already know that. The nature of our practice as global indigenous peoples is this space of interbeing, this awareness of life, this awareness of nature, and sitting inside of that with an attention and an appreciation and a gratitude. This knowing we're always connected, similar to what Buddha did under the tree. We're not outside of this practice, we are a part of this practice. One might even say global indigenous or indigenous ideology is this practice. It's not even some might say, I do say. It is this practice. What it has become might make us believe that this is something we have to reach for, has to be taught to us, but it's really about a remembering, a coming back to it, a reconnection to it. It's about our work decolonizing the self to recall our many relationships to our planet and all beings. That's the awareness maybe that we should be having now through Buddhism. Our attention, one last thing. Our attention when we sit on our cushion, the awareness that we are cultivating is not for ourselves, not for ourselves only. That knowing that it isn't in itself is very characteristic of what it means to be Indigenous, where we care for both ourselves and the collective simultaneously, where we are practicing in a way to leave this planet better than how we found it, to touch into um, that spirit that animates all of life when we're sitting there cultivating that presence on the cushion. That understanding of the collective is the antithesis of colonization, the antithesis of westernization. And so, where we see that showing up in our Dharma halls or Dharma communities, please know that that is not a marker that you are doing it wrong. That could be a demarcation that how you show up when you think and or feel in your Indigenous way culturally there on your cushion is actually the practice.
I wanted to invite you to take up this question of the sense of being connected to a tradition in which the Buddha turned his back on the kingly path consciously and walked away from power.
Mm-hmm.
And yet,
Mm-hmm.
when we look at the history of the transmission of Buddhist teachings,
Mm-hmm.
and also when we look at the shape that some of the communities that are being established now, what we're seeing is that there were long histories of alignment with power
Mm-hmm.
and alignment with imperial interests or being
Mm-hmm.
backed by kings and emperors. And you know, there's a question of what does this history of alignment with oppressive structures,
Mm.
how does that relate to this stream that you're calling us to drink from of liberatory practice, that it is rooted in that time that you described?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
evocatively of Buddha sitting with his back to the tree and just listening to spirit move through the leaves. These are two different impulses that you're pointing to.
Mm-hmm. I would say they are and they aren't, because Buddha was also invited to many, many kings' places upon his path as a part of helping and to acknowledge that the space, uh, I'd like to think of it as like, again, going back to this idea of interbeing. I want to say also that I would liken that to acknowledging that within my being, I have the capacity of being it all. I believe that Buddha understood that, especially so clearly, like that example, right? He was on his right, he was on his way to becoming a king, taking over for his pops. That was where he was going. And I think he understood he chose a different path. I don't believe he turned his back on those beings or that essence or quality of being, which is that desire for power, that interest of wanting to be seen, leadership. I don't think he turned his back on it as much as he was aware of what it could do, i.e., the cultivation of awareness. And I think in our practice, the practice in itself for me has just continuously been about choice, choosing, 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 choosing. And I've become aware that I have the ability to choose. And that makes me very free. No matter what any government or society wants to tell me, I am always in this ability to choose in each moment how I want to be. That is what I practice towards. And so I believe when Buddha was going to these palaces and invited by these kings and asked to really teach the practice to help support them rounding out and or learning the things that they missed, I think that he understood that this was not only it was, I won't say it was a part of his purpose only, because I have to be mindful of that too, right? Like when, and I think this is the, can be the monastic way, right? When we then, and I liken this sometimes to Christianity or other tradition, all of our traditions, any tradition where we can be so dogmatic that we then start to proselytize because it is my responsibility to teach and to teach you what to do and how to be. I don't think that's actually what he was doing. I think he was invited to share what he experienced in his life. And it was pleasing and powerful because they could see it in action. But I ultimately believe that this idea of us being in relationship to power, well, I have lots of thoughts about that. So I'm going to put that one over there for a second. But being in relationship to systemic power, institutionalized power, as this has been primarily the spaces where this has been transmitted, there's lots to say about that. But I think first I'll say from the storytelling of Buddha, this was a vehicle to help that was a part of his path, and very specifically his path. This was something that allowed for that teaching to make it here. Because of his teachings, I know he went into those spaces without the judgment or aware of judgment, so that the transmission and he, one could say, be used by spirit to offer what was needed there, the medicine. This is kind of, I would liken the same to Jesus. Jesus went and hung out with the prostitutes for a reason, right? This idea of being used by spirit because you now understand your purpose after the vision quest. There's a way in which you get out the way. Now, if we're talking about the way in which we as beings use the power, this is also something I think he was aware of. I think we can be aware of. We also know that there are monks within this path, teachers, great teachers in this tradition that have improperly used their relationship to power. That's again choice. That's again practice. I don't know if I would say, and this might be a bit controversial, if the institution, quote unquote, is the issue as much as how it's identified, how it's held, what it is, what it represents, how they're conducting themselves is more the issue. Plum Village happens to be an institution for Thich Nhat Hanh, and I love so many of my teachers there. And many people have found their path through being in that space. I think it's about, yeah, again, I think it's about the individual, uh, our individual commitment to how and in what way we live our life, our relationship to spirit, our relationship to our path and purpose that ultimately impacts what we create in this world, be it institutions, communities, you name it. We've seen really beautiful examples of uh, communities that have been created through the acknowledgement of their power. And we've seen some that are absolutely terrible. I don't believe power in itself inherently is terrible or bad. I do not. Power to me is equivalent to force. Force is the same thing as I would say is the energy or the will of spirit. It is not something that I deem as terrible or bad characteristically. And colonization is its own force. It's its own force with many individuals who chose to do something very specific with their power. The Zapatistas are a force. Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, the Mormon community that supported Harriet Tubman. Force, great power. Angela Davis, great power. So I think that you mentioned imperialism specifically. I also refer to it sometimes as colonization. And I think in my desire to recenter the wisdom, the people, the culture, the true force that is this indigenous tradition, our indigenous ways, indigenous communities, indigenous peoples. I'd like to give less attention to the to those who took advantage of our power and honor those who ultimately held and still hold so much power. I just want to recenter us. I want to recenter um, spirit. Am I making sense?
Absolutely. You have offered so much richness into this field. I kind of just want to stop and like have some sort of final question because we're already at an hour and that's how long our talks are. And I don't see anything I want to edit out,
It's
which is kind of a problem. Usually, like, I got
it's a
lots of,
long one.
um, so yeah, I mean, I'll find a little snippet here, like when you asked me,
Mhm.
oh, was that right? And oh, you had your hand up, like I would take that out, which would give us about 10 seconds maybe. I want to ask you like some kind of,
Framing to close it.
yeah, and um, I don't know if you have anything in mind, but I would kind of love if you could kind of address specifically people who don't know what community or don't have a home in the
Mm.
native community that they have ancestry in and have this
Mhm.
longing.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure how to ask it.
Yeah,
Or
I
maybe
think
you
you
could
did.
just,
I think you did. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So I will just share that, though in the beginning of this time together, I listed all of my traditions and my background and who my people are. And um, about 10% of that was given to me as a kid. And even growing up as an adult, the 90 I went to go find. The 90% of my awareness of who I am, I went to go find. And it isn't because we weren't doing it in my house. That was the thing. We were doing it. We were 10% doing it. But there was not a lot of language for it. I was very lucky because my mother has been a record keeper of our ancestors for a very long time. So I have ancestor trees. And I understand that to be a gift. And especially for someone who looks like me, a privilege. And there are a couple things that, because I've been asked a question before like this around, I don't know who my peoples are. How do I find them? How do I teach this framework to community who has been adopted? How do I teach this community, just to framework to a community that's been displaced? The reason why that 10% was such a powerful gift and a seed is because those were the 10%. That's a strong 10% that no one could take away from me. That's something I could feel. I'll tell a little cute story. I was about 4 years old, and I was being watched by my grandfather, my great uncle on my mother's side, and my grandmother on my father's side. And they left the back door open. Outside, we had a poisonberry bush, and we had a little shed in the backyard. And I crawled out. I crawled out and I played with the berries. There's evidence because it was later on my clothes, but it was all over the floor. And then I crawled out some more. When I crawled out and I laid and was found fast asleep, surrounded by bunnies behind the shed. It's the first time I'm telling that story and understanding better now. That's the 10%. My relationship to the planet, to spirit, to my purpose was all in that one moment. And no one can take that away from me. There are moments when we are in deep relationship with our planet. There are moments when we sit at the foot of elders and just want to hear stories. There are moments when the tongue, the sound of our language that we haven't learned, we hear and it strikes our body like a lightning rod up our spine. There are moments when we taste something and it feels so familiar, but no one's ever made it. There are moments when intuitively and instinctually we know the truth of who we are. And it's in the body. Never be taken away. And that's where we begin our practice of remembering who we are, rematriating to ourselves with honor and integrity, going to find our ancestry. I hope that answered your question. Mm. Didn't expect that one.
May these words that we've shared fall like berries on a hungry earth. And may all beings looking for their home fall asleep on the earth and awaken surrounded by their furry relatives feasting on their quest.
Thank you.
Thank you for these gifts.